We don't start this story at the beginning of the journey. Instead, we start with its horrible end, which was buried for almost 100 years. When they were clearing an old-growth forest in 1958 to make way for what would become the Foothills Parkway, a logger's chainsaw hit something deep inside a tulip poplar that had been hit by lightning. It wasn't a rock, it was a leather bag that had gotten wet. A sketchbook was inside, safe from the dry, dark space of the old tree. There were beautiful, delicate drawings of Appalachian landscapes on every page. The logger turned the brittle pages and the peaceful scenes turned into something terrifying. The last drawings were a terrifying, frantic record of fear. Stick-like figures hiding behind trees, a flower that seemed to pulse with evil light, and a final, horrifying self-portrait of a young woman with vines coming out of her eyes. Ara and Lyra Finch were two sisters who walked into the Great Smoky Mountains in the fall of 1884 and disappeared. This sketchbook is the only thing that proves they were there. Before we go into the dark parts of this disturbing cold case, please leave a comment with where you are and what time it is where you are. We are curious about where and when these forbidden histories find their audience. The Finch sisters' story isn't one of getting lost in the woods. It's a creepy story about finding something that should have stayed hidden and the terrible cost of that discovery. The mountains themselves have tried to forget this story. The official record in Sevier County, Tennessee, is short and to the point. It comes to the conclusion that Ara Finch, 24, and her sister Lyra, 21, probably died from exposure or an attack by a predator after getting lost in the rough terrain. But the bits of evidence that have come to light over the years point to a much more planned and evil end. A conspiracy of silence that has lasted for more than 140 years has hidden the truth about what happened to them. This case doesn't just show a simple tragedy. It shows a terrible local custom, a dark secret that runs deep in the mountains, and a community that will do anything to protect it. Those who did have the courage to ask questions were met with vague threats and a wall of silence that could not be broken. Evidence disappeared from locked rooms. Official reports were changed, and a deathbed confession that could have solved the whole mystery was ignored as the ramblings of a dying mind and buried in an archive, with the most important page torn out. The tale of the Finch sisters takes you deep into the heart of the Appalachian darkness, where reality and folklore mix in the scariest ways. It's a creepy reminder that some of the oldest and darkest parts of America weren't really settled in the 19th century. They were just home to communities with their own laws and horrible customs. What you're about to hear is a reconstruction of their last days, based on a few journal entries, the cursed sketchbook, and testimony that was meant to stay buried forever. Knoxville, Tennessee, was a city that was having trouble with its future in the fall of 1884. The scars of the Civil War were still fresh, and the industrial age was pushing against the old wilderness that loomed to the east. Ara and Lyra Finch came from this world. They were the daughters of a rich merchant, which was very unusual for women of their time. They got a good education and upbringing. Ara was a talented amateur botanist whose interest in the field grew as natural science became more popular. She was organized, motivated, and had a mind that wanted to sort things out and make sense of the world. Her one and only goal for this trip was to be the first person to find and officially record a rare plant that is only known in local folklore as the Appalachian ghost orchid. Stories said it was a flower that bloomed in the deepest, darkest parts of the mountains where there was no sunlight. Lyra, her younger sister, was the opposite of her, a romantic and a great artist. Ara saw systems and species, but Lyra saw light, shadow, and feelings. She went with her sister to draw the wild, natural beauty of the Smokies on paper, making a visual record of a wilderness that was already starting to disappear because of the timber company's axes. Knoxville society thought it was strange for two young single women to go into a place that was thought to be the territory of tough, rough men. Their gender, class, and even their purpose made them outsiders. They weren't trying to tame or use the mountains. They just wanted to learn about them and write about them. This goal would put them on a collision course with a community that fiercely protected its secrets. The Great Smoky Mountains weren't a national park in 1884 like they are now. They were a huge, uncharted maze of ridges, hollows, and thick forests. The rhododendron thicket made them impossible to get through, so they were called hells. It was a whole world on its own. The families who lived there were very cut off from the rest of the world. Their ancestors had settled in these remote coves generations before, bringing with them traditions and beliefs from the Old World, like Scotland, Ireland, and Germanic areas that had long since died out elsewhere. People in these communities were very independent, clannish, and suspicious of outsiders, whom they called flatlanders. They didn't see the arrival of the railroad and the timber barons as progress. They saw it as an invasion. They thought that government workers, surveyors, and scientists were all working for a world that wanted to end their way of life. The Finch sisters would have been seen as intruders as soon as they stepped foot in the foothills because of their nice clothes, smart speech, and scientific tools. On October 12, 1884, they set out on their journey. They rode in a carriage to the small town of White Oak Flats, which would later be called Gatlinburg. They hired a local guide named Jebediah Sutton to take them to a trailhead deeper in the mountains. This was the last confirmed sighting of Ara and Lyra Finch that no one could argue with. Sutton's later testimony to the sheriff was short and not very useful. He said the sisters were full of strange ideas and too sure of themselves. He said he told them that the mountains don't like being poked and prodded, but they didn't listen. Sutton left them at the start of a trail that led to a place the locals called Cade's Cove. This place already had its own legends and dark past. The sisters' abandoned campsite had a small leather-bound journal that belonged to Ara. The first few entries, even though they were damaged by water, show a sense of scientific wonder and youthful hope. Ara keeps careful records of the plants and animals, and her handwriting is neat and clear. She says that Lyra has already filled a dozen pages of her sketchbook with pictures of old hemlocks and foggy valleys. But on the third day, the tone of the journal starts to change in small ways. An entry from October 15th says, "The air here feels heavy and old. Lyra says she always feels like someone is watching her, which I thought was just her imagination, but I also feel uneasy. The silence is deep, almost unnatural. Even the birds seem to be afraid to sing." The next day, Ara talks about a disturbing discovery. Found strange carvings on several trees along the creek bed. Not Cherokee symbols, nor anything I recognize. They look like a lattice work of branches, almost like a human figure made of sticks, enclosed in a circle. Lyra refused to sketch it, saying it felt like a curse. This small detail is the first sign that the sisters had gone off the beaten path and into a place marked by something else. They weren't just in the wild anymore. They were in someone's territory. That night, Ara's entry is shorter and the handwriting is a little less neat. Heard sounds from the ridge above our camp after dark. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like a low, rhythmic chant. Lyra was scared. I got my father's gun, but when I looked, I didn't see anything. The feeling of being watched is no longer a fantasy. It is a certainty. On the fifth day, the sisters were deep in a remote valley that the local guide had told them not to go to. He only called it Whispering Cove. Local legends say that the name came from the way the wind moved through the strange rock formations, making sounds that sounded like quiet, hissing voices. In this cove, nature seemed different and older. Ara's journal entries show a mix of scientific excitement and growing fear. She talks about plants she can't name, mosses that glow with a faint phosphorescence in the dark, and a sickly sweet smell in the air that she can't find the source of. Lyra's art takes a dark turn here. Ara writes, Lyra's work has become unsettling. She no longer sketches the grand landscapes. Instead, she obsessively draws the strange symbols we found and peoples her drawings with shadowy, elongated figures lurking just at the edge of the tree line. When I confronted her, she claimed she isn't inventing them, but drawing what she feels is there, just beyond our sight. Her nerves are frayed. She sleeps little and speaks of recurring nightmares. This change in Lyra's art, which was recorded in the recovered sketchbook, is a horrifying visual record of their growing psychological distress. The mountains were no longer a place of beauty and wonder. They were now a place where scary, unseen things lived. They were going into the heart of a local taboo, a place that was off-limits and protected by more than just rough terrain. The cove's whispers were starting to get into their heads. They had to find shelter on October 18th because their supplies were running low and Lyra's mental health was getting worse. A thin trail of smoke on a faraway ridge led them to a lonely homestead, a group of rough-hewn log buildings deep in Whispering Cove. The Blackwood family owned the property. They had lived in the cove for almost 100 years and had very little contact with the outside world. Ara's journal says that the head of the family, Silas Blackwood, looks as old and weathered as the mountains themselves, with eyes as dark and deep as a well. The sisters were not welcomed by the family, Silas, his wife, and their 4 grown sons, who were all very quiet and cold. They gave them salted pork and cornbread to eat, and they did so in complete silence. That night, Ara wrote in her journal about how scared she was. The Blackwoods are unsettling. They speak in a dialect so thick it is almost another language. They move with a strange, silent grace, and their eyes, all of them, have a peculiar lack of light. Lyra noted that none of them cast a clear shadow in the firelight. They answered my questions about the local flora with monosyllabic grunts, except when I mentioned the ghost orchid. At the name, the old man Silas fixed me with a stare of such intensity that I felt a chill despite the warmth of the hearth. He said only, "Some things ain't meant for outsiders to find. We are to sleep in their barn tonight. I feel a profound sense of foreboding. We should have turned back." Staying at the Blackwood homestead was a deadly mistake, a step over a line that couldn't be crossed again. That night in the barn, Ara woke up to the same low chanting she had heard before, but this time it was much closer. She saw something that didn't make any sense when she looked through a crack in the wooden slats. The whole Blackwood family was standing in a circle in a clearing behind the main house. The strange light from the phosphorescent moss they had packed into clay jars lit up the area. They were chanting and swaying in a strange, guttural language. Ara's journal entry is almost unreadable because the writing is so wild and hurried. They are not praying. It is something else entirely, something ancient and unholy. Silas held a wooden idol carved into the same stick-like figure from the trees. One by one, they consumed something from a stone bowl, a pale, pulpy substance. After, their movements became frenzied, almost inhuman. It is a ritual. God help us, we have stumbled upon some dark pagan rite. What happened next made the horror of what she was seeing even worse. One of the sons, his face twisted in a silent ecstasy, turned his head and looked right at the barn, right at the crack where Ara was hiding. The same faint, pale light that the moss gave off seemed to come from his eyes. Ari wrote, "He saw me. I'm sure of it. They know we're watching. We have to leave at first light." But first light would be too late. They were no longer just unwanted guests, they were witnesses. The next morning, the act of being polite was over. The Blackwood's cold silence was gone, and in its place was a watchful, predatory stillness. Silas Blackwood told the sisters that a storm was coming and that it would not be safe for them to go outside. Ara insisted that the sky was clear. One of the sons, a big man named Enoch, stepped forward and blocked their way. He held a big hunting knife in one hand and cleaned his nails with it while keeping an eye on the sisters. The threat was clear, but not spoken. They were prisoners. Ara made her fateful discovery on this scary day, when she was trying to understand her captors. She saw Silas's wife taking care of a small, walled-off garden behind the house while the family was busy. There were not vegetables inside, but rows of a strange, pale, leafless plant with one ghostly white flower. The ghost orchid was it. Ara's frantic journal entry says, "It is here, the ghost orchid, but it is cultivated. It grows in soil mixed with what looks like bone meal, and the smell, that sickly sweet scent, is coming from them. Dear God, the orchids are growing directly from what appear to be unmarked burial mounds. It is a garden of the dead." In that moment, the horrible truth began to dawn on her. The orchid, the ceremony, and the bone meal were all linked. The Blackwoods weren't just hiding a rare plant. They were doing a creepy kind of farming that was against the law and made them secretive and angry. For a short, deadly moment, Ara's scientific curiosity beat out her fear. She confronted Silas Blackwood, telling him that she had seen his garden and recognized the orchid. She thought she could still save her trip in some way. She tried to convince him from a scientific point of view by explaining how important it was and promising to give him credit for finding it. This was her last terrible mistake. She didn't expect the reaction. Silas Blackwood didn't get mad. He got very calm. Ara's last journal entry, dated October 20th, 1884, says that the old man just smiled, which was a scary, predatory look. He spoke in a thick, scary dialect and said that the flower was their soul and sustenance. He called it the animeratics, or soul root. He said it grew only from the flesh of their ancestors, preserving their essence, and that by eating its pulp, the family renewed its strength and connection to the land. He told her that they didn't need anything from the outside world because the cove had everything they needed. Then he said in a scary way, "You see our garden, you see our way. The mountain has brought you to us. It is a gift. The garden is hungry. It needs new soil." The last line of the journal entry is a single, messy, unfinished sentence. He says we are to be planted. He says we will be part of the rest of the page is smeared, as if someone had violently taken the journal from her hands. After this entry, there are 20 blank pages, and then, for no apparent reason, there is one perfect pressed ghost orchid specimen with roots that are a dark, rusty brown. Harrison Finch, the father of the Finch sisters, started to worry when they didn't come back to Knoxville by the agreed-upon date in mid-November. His worry turned to panic by December. He put together a private search party made up of experienced mountaineers and trackers from Knoxville. They left in the harsh early winter weather, following the path that Ara had written about in letters home. The group had no trouble finding the sisters' first campsite, but as they got closer to Whispering Cove, they ran into a strange set of problems that slowed them down. Trails they had been told about were suddenly gone, as if they had never been there. It looked like trees had fallen on purpose to block their way. The families they talked to in the area didn't help at all, saying they hadn't seen any sign of the two young women and being rude to the search party. Harrison Finch used his power to get the Sevier County Sheriff, Josiah Gann, to start an official search. However, the search was strangely poorly done. Harrison Finch didn't find out until much later, that Sheriff Gann was a distant cousin of the Blackwood clan. The official search only lasted 3 days. The last report said that the sisters' second camp had been found in a mess. The supplies were all over the place and the tent was ripped. The report said that a bear attack was the most likely thing to have happened, even though no body parts, blood, or torn clothes were ever found. The case was officially over. Sheriff Gann and the people who lived there thought the Finch sisters had been lost in the woods. It was the easiest explanation, and it made sure that no one would ever look any closer. Harrison Finch would not believe the official story. He spent a lot of money over the next 10 years on private investigations, hiring detectives from as far away as Philadelphia. They all came back with the same story, a wall of silence that couldn't be broken. People in and around the Smoky Mountains came together. People either pretended not to know the name Blackwood or were openly hostile. In 1888, a former Pinkerton agent named Cormac Riley wrote a chilling report to his boss. "I have investigated conspiracies, labor racketeers, and murderers' dens, but I have never encountered a silence so absolute. It is not fear that keeps these people quiet. It is a shared, profound secret. They are hiding something not just from the law, but from the very eyes of God." An elderly woman in a nearby settlement warned him to stop asking questions about the soul eaters of the cove. She claimed the Blackwoods practiced a forbidden botany and that the 2 missing girls had been given back to the soil. When Riley pressed her for more, her son physically removed him from the property, warning that some roots are best left undisturbed. Riley's investigation ended abruptly when his hotel room was broken into and all his notes on the case were stolen. The next morning, he found a dead raven on his doorstep with the petals of a pale white flower stuffed into its beak. He gave up on the investigation and left Tennessee that same day. The message was clear. The community would do anything to protect its own and its terrible secrets. For 50 years, the story of the Finch sisters was lost to official records and became part of creepy folklore. People told it around campfires as a ghost story and as a warning to kids who got too close to the dark coves in the mountains. People outside of the community heard the story of the Flower Sisters, which served as a warning. But it seemed like the truth would stay hidden, that is until 1937. As part of the Federal Writers Project of the Works Progress Administration, a young folklorist named Arabelle Crane went to the Smoky Mountains to collect and protect the area's oral histories. She talked to an old woman named Elizabeth McCoon in a cabin far away. She was dying. Elizabeth was a child in 1884, and her family lived next door to the Blackwoods. She was so guilty and scared that she had been quiet for her whole life, so she decided to tell what she had seen. Crane transcribed her recorded testimony, which is a terrifying first-hand account of the sisters' last hours. The paper, which was later filed away and marked unsubstantiated, is the closest thing to a solution this cold case has ever had. It confirms Harrison Finch's and the Pinkerton detectives' worst fears, showing a picture of ritualistic murder that is so strange and disturbing that it almost seems impossible. Please subscribe to this channel right away if you find these hidden histories interesting. The details of Elizabeth McCoon's deathbed confession are so dark that you can't even begin to imagine them. They will change how you see the wild's deep, quiet places. The folklorist wrote down Elizabeth McCoon's voice, which was a weak whisper, but her words were heavy with the weight of a 50-year-old burden. She told how her father had been called to the Blackwood property on the night of October 20th, 1884, as was the custom among the oldest families in the cove. He was there to testify. Elizabeth, a scared and curious child, had followed him without telling him. She watched the same scary ritual Ara Finch had written about in her journal, but this time it was even scarier because it was focused on something. Lyra Finch was in the middle of the circle, tied to a big, upright stone with a stick figure symbol on it. They weren't screaming. They were done with it, Elizabeth said. Their eyes were wide, looking at something beyond us all. The younger one, the artist, was crying quietly. The older one, the plant lady, just stared at Silas Blackwood with a look of understanding, as if she had figured out the whole terrible puzzle. As the high priest, Silas Blackwood spoke to the families who had come. He said that the mountain had given them a gift to make their sacred garden stronger. He said that the sisters had done a terrible sin by trying to steal the soul of the cove, and that the only way to make up for it was to become part of the soil, which feeds the root that feeds us all. The confession shows that the Blackwood clan's terrible purpose in life was not just to farm, but to tend to a garden of people. The part of Elizabeth McCoon's confession that is most disturbing is the ritual itself. She called it the replanting, and it was a methodical and terrifying process. The Blackwoods believed that the sisters were not just being killed, but that they were also being changed. Elizabeth said that Silas Blackwood came up to Ara first, holding a small sharp knife made of obsidian. He didn't kill her. Instead, he made a series of small, exact cuts on her arms and legs. The other family members pushed a paste made from the crushed roots of the ghost orchid into these cuts. Elizabeth says that Silas told the scared sisters that this would prepare their blood for the soil and calm their spirits for the long sleep. The paste, which probably had strong psychoactive or paralytic chemicals in it, seemed to work right away. The sisters' bodies went limp, and their eyes stayed open but empty. They were still alive, but they were stuck in their own heads and had to watch what was going to happen. The same horrible thing happened to Lyra. Elizabeth said, "The family was chanting that low, humming sound the whole time. It wasn't a sound of anger, it was reverent, like they were performing a holy sacrament. It was the holiest, most evil thing I ever saw. The confession shows that the crime was planned and believed in a way that makes it more than just a murder. It was a human sacrifice meant to please and feed the forbidden being they worshipped." The last horrible part of the ritual started after the sisters were drugged and paralyzed. There were 2 shallow graves that had just been dug at the edge of the ghost orchid garden. They put Ara and Lyra inside them, and they were still alive. Elizabeth McCoon's story goes on, and her written words shake with remembered horror. They laid them in the earth. The family then brought baskets of their special soil. The dirt from around the big parent orchids, mixed with bone and ash from the others, before they packed it around the girls, covering them up to their necks. Their faces were left exposed to the moonlight. Silas said it was so the soul root could find them. The 2 sisters were buried alive, their heads just above the ground, their bodies encased in the horrific fertilizer of the Blackwood's garden. Elizabeth says that the family then started a final chant, and Silas Blackwood took a mature ghost orchid out of a basket. He carefully pulled 2 small root bulbs away from the main plant. He knelt down between the 2 sisters who were buried. He told them that their Flatlander knowledge would now nourish true wisdom, and that their restless spirits would find peace in the root. He then did the last act of replanting, shoving 1 root bulb into each of the sisters' open mouths and pushing it deep into their throats. The ceremony was over. The sisters were going to be the new base for the next generation of ghost orchids. Elizabeth's confession explains what happened next. The Blackwood clan and the family who saw it all stood watch all night, chanting softly as the sisters slowly suffocated. The psychoactive paste kept them paralyzed and unable to fight back. They were gone by morning. Her father told her that this was how it had always been done. This was how the first Blackwood made a deal with the spirit of the mountain hundreds of years ago. People who came from outside the community and saw too much were not killed. Instead, they were assimilated and became part of the land, with their life force feeding the plant that kept the community alive. This terrifying new information changes the whole mystery. The lack of blood, bodies, and noise from the community all made sense. There was no crime scene to find because the bodies of the sisters were the crime scene. They had become part of the Blackwood's holy garden. When Sheriff Gann and his official search party arrived weeks later, the Blackwoods just had to show them a fake bear attack site that was far away from their home. The sheriff, who was in on the secret, did his job and made sure the investigation didn't go anywhere near Whispering Cove. The perfect crime, hidden by a shared, terrifying belief system and years of silence from people who knew about it. Elizabeth said that Silas Blackwood kept Lyra's sketchbook as a trophy, a reminder of the gift the mountain had given them. She said he would sometimes look through its pages like he was admiring a treasure. Arabelle Crane, a folklorist, was very upset by what she had heard. She knew she had found the answer to a well-known cold case that had been open for 50 years. Elizabeth McCoon's testimony was clear and consistent, which I think makes it very credible. She gave details, like the description of the obsidian knife and the stick figure idol, that couldn't have been made up from local gossip. "I believe she was telling the truth," she wrote in her report notes. Crane sent the WPA office in Asheville her transcription of the confession and her field report. She said that the police should be told. The answer she got was scary on its own. A high-ranking official told her to take back the suggestion. He told her that the WPA's job was to gather folklore, not to dig up old graves and cause trouble with mountain folk. He put the confession in the deepest part of the archives and called it Category F, Fantastical or Superstitious Accounts. A researcher found a handwritten note in the file's margin decades later that said, "Crane is not to return to Sevier County. Some families still have power. Let the dead stay buried." The official world chose to ignore it once more. The truth was too horrible, too hard to believe, and the community it affected was still too protective of its dark past. The confession was effectively buried, which was another way to silence the Finch sisters. The story could have ended there, as a scary but unproven footnote in a little-known government file. The logger's discovery of Lyra Finch's sketchbook in 1958, though, brought the cold case back to life, at least for a little while. The book, which was bent and weak, was given to the police. A forensic art expert said that the early drawings of Knoxville and the outer Smokies were similar to Lyra Finch's known works. This proved that the sketchbook was real, and by extension, the horrible last pages. The drawings were a direct visual confirmation of Elizabeth McCoon's confession. There were pictures of the stick figure symbols that had been carved into trees. There were pictures of the Blackwood family that showed how eerily still they were, with dark eyes that were terrifyingly accurate. There was a detailed drawing of the ghost orchid, but it didn't look like a plant. It looked like a scary creature that was almost alive. And then came the last drawings that scared people, a scary, messy picture of the ritual in the clearing, the bound sisters, and the chanting figures. The last full drawing was the most disturbing. It was a self-portrait from a low angle, as if looking up from a grave. Lyra's eyes are wide with fear in the drawing, and a pale, root-like tendril is clearly coming out of her mouth. It was Lyra's last act of testimony, a message from beyond the grave that she wrote down in the last moments before she died. It was undeniable visual proof of the terrible things Elizabeth had talked about. The discovery of the sketchbook caused a brief stir in the news. For a few weeks, newspapers in Knoxville and Nashville wrote about the cursed artist of the Smokies. The Sevier County Sheriff's Office, under pressure, reopened the cold case from 1884, but the investigation was doomed from the start. It had been 74 years. The main people involved, the Blackwoods, Sheriff Gann, and Elizabeth McCoon, had all died a long time ago. The Blackwood homestead in Whispering Cove had been empty for decades and was taken over by the forest. Investigators who tried to find the property using old maps were not able to do so. The landscape had changed, and the original landmarks were no longer there. Some people in the area said that a fever outbreak in the 1920s killed off the whole Blackwood family. Some people said they had just gone deeper into the mountains and moved to an even more remote area when the national park was created. The investigation did not find any new physical evidence. There was no knife, no bodies, and no garden. The sketchbook and the old WPA confession were seen as strong but circumstantial evidence because there was no body or crime scene. The case was closed again, this time for good, after 6 months of searching that didn't lead to anything. It is still not clear what caused Ara and Lyra Finch's deaths. Once again, the mountains had kept their secret safe, but the story doesn't quite end there. Elizabeth McCoon's confession, which was buried in the WPA archives, had one last scary detail that folklorist Arabelle Crane had written down but didn't understand at the time. Before the replanting, Silas Blackwood took a small silver locket off of Ara Finch's neck, Elizabeth said. He thought it was an unnatural object and wouldn't let it be buried in his holy garden. Instead, he threw it into a stream nearby. This fact was forgotten until 2003. A biologist found a small, tarnished object stuck between 2 stones in the creek bed while doing a biological survey of aquatic life in a remote, unnamed tributary of the Little Pigeon River, deep within the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It was a locket made of silver. It was only a few miles from where people thought Whispering Cove was. The locket was very rusty, but when it was carefully opened in a lab, it still had 2 small, faded pictures inside. Harrison Finch was a serious-looking man with a big mustache on one side. On the other side was a beautiful woman with dark hair. She was the sisters' mother and had died years before their trip. It was almost 120 years after it was thrown away that Ara Finch's locket was finally found. The initials AF were engraved on the back, but they were hard to read. It was the first piece of physical evidence that belonged to the sisters that was found. The discovery of the locket sparked a new wave of interest from amateur historians and people who like to solve cold cases. Dr. Marcus Thorne, a professor of Appalachian Studies at the University of Tennessee, spent years comparing old maps, geological surveys, and the few unedited notes from the WPA project. He was sure that the Blackwood clan's beliefs weren't unique, but were instead part of a much older folk religion that combined different beliefs and survived in the most remote parts of the mountains. He found obscure references in the 18th century European texts to a secretive cult that worshipped a psychoactive fungus, which they thought would let them talk to the spirits of the earth. The way they talked about their rituals was very similar to how Elizabeth McCoon confessed. Thorne's idea was scary. The Blackwoods weren't just one strange family. They were the last known people to follow an ancient, pre-Christian religion that involved ritual human sacrifice and a type of cannibalism with a plant. He thought that the ghost orchid was not a native Appalachian plant at all. The first settlers of the cove brought over a type of European plant and carefully grew it for hundreds of years. Its psychoactive effects were made stronger by the strange and scary way it grew. The sisters didn't just find a family secret. They also found the last piece of a dark religion that had been hiding in the mountains for years. Dr. Thorne's research led him to a troubling conclusion about what would happen to the Blackwood family. Official records said that they had died out, but Thorne found stories of a pale, quiet family who bought a big, remote piece of land in the North Carolina mountains in the late 1920s and paid for it in gold coins. The place they moved to was, and still is, one of the hardest to get to in the whole Appalachian range. Thorne thought they hadn't died out. Instead, they had moved their whole terrifying business when the modern world, in the form of the national park, started to get too close to their sacred space. He thought that the garden might still be there in a dark, forgotten hollow somewhere. In 1999, this theory got a little bit of scary support. 2 hikers went missing in a remote area of the Nantahala National Forest, in the same area that Thorne had pointed out. A long search found their empty campsite, where their gear was still there, but the 2 hikers were nowhere to be found. The only strange thing that search and rescue teams found was a set of strange symbols carved into trees near the campsite. The official report said that the symbols looked like a person made of lattice sticks. The mystery is still unsolved. The scary thought stays. Did the Blackwood's descendants keep up their replanting ritual into the 20th century? Had 2 more innocent people been returned to the soil to feed the cove's soul? The last piece of this horrible puzzle, and maybe the most creepy, is the ghost orchid itself. After Dr. Thorne's research was published, a number of botanists tried to figure out what flower was pressed into Ara Finch's journal. There is no known type of orchid in North America that has the same shape as this one. It looks like a one-of-a-kind organism. A small dried piece of the pressed flower was collected in 2012 for DNA testing. The results were unclear and very confusing. The plant had genetic markers from the orchid family, but it also had something else that couldn't be identified. DNA sequences that the lab report says are a complex fungal viral hybrid of unknown origin. The analysis found small amounts of human mitochondrial DNA embedded in the plant's cells, which is the most disturbing thing of all. It was clear that the DNA was there, but it was too damaged to be identified. This scientific discovery lends a terrifying credence to the Blackwood's belief system. In a literal sense, the plant was eating and incorporating the DNA of the animals it fed on. The animoratics, or soul root, was more than just a name. It was a very accurate description of how the organism worked. The Finch sisters were not just put in the ground. Their DNA, which is what makes them who they are, was taken in and became part of the thing they had accidentally found. Their bodies and souls were, and maybe still are, blooming in a dark, secret garden somewhere in the old mountains. The story of Ara and Lyra Finch is now somewhere between a historical cold case and dark American folklore. Millions of people hike the trails in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park every year, making it the most popular national park in the U.S. Most of them have no idea about the terrible things that happened just off the paths. There is no mention of the Finch sisters, the Blackwood clan, or the soul eaters of Whispering Cove in the official park histories. The story has been cleaned up and taken out of the official story, but the story lives on among the descendants of the oldest families in the area. There are still whispers. They talk about a hungry hollow that you should stay away from, a sweet, sickly smell that comes on the wind on some autumn nights, and a pale white flower that sometimes grows on graves, but no one wants to touch. The story is a strong reminder of how bad things can get when you're alone. People from the mountains are different, and so is their loyalty. For the Blackwoods, their faith is different and scary. In their world, there were its own gods, laws, and ways of punishing wrongdoers. If you liked this look into forbidden history, please think about becoming a channel member to help us out. Members can see content that is only available to them and learn more about the creepy evidence behind cases like this one. Your help lets us keep finding the stories that have been hidden on purpose. The sisters' mental health in their last days can only be understood by putting together Ara's frantic last entries and Lyra's scary drawings. Imagine how the fear grew. First, they felt like they were being watched. Then, they found the disturbing symbols. Next, they had an unsettling encounter with the silent, watchful Blackwoods. And finally, they realized they were trapped. Ara, the scientist, would have tried to make sense of what was going on by using logic, but she would have found that logic had no place in this world. Her last journal entry shows how her scientific view of the world fell apart when she faced an old, ritualistic horror. Her mind, which tried to put things in order and categorize them, was faced with a practice that twisted nature in the most extreme way possible. For Lyra, the artist, the experience would have been even more real. Her ability to feel things deeply, which made her a great artist, also made her very vulnerable to the psychological terror of the Cove. Her sketchbook is a place where her mind is falling apart. The dark shapes she drew weren't just made up. They were her way of showing the evil presence she felt, the psychic residue of a place that had seen generations of violence and dark ritual. The last self-portrait is more than just a drawing. It's a scream, a last, desperate attempt to show how horrible it was for her to feel her body and soul being eaten up by the earth and the will of the horrible flower. One of the most frightening things about this case is how many people in the community were involved. The Blackwoods weren't completely on their own. Elizabeth McCoon's confession shows that other families were there at the ritual, acting as witnesses and giving their approval by being there. This was not the work of one crazy family. It was a tradition that the whole community followed. Investigators ran into a wall of silence that wasn't just to protect neighbors. It was also to protect their shared identity and the horrible secret they all shared. In the Smokies of the 1800s, people often had to follow strict community rules in order to survive, even if those rules seemed terrible to people from outside the area. The replanting ritual may have helped these isolated clans feel like they were in charge of their world, keep the modern world at bay, and literally root their lives into the land they lived on. They weren't just hiding a murder. They were protecting a way of life and a point of view that is so strange and scary to us now that it's hard to understand. The sheriff's involvement, the ignoring of reports, and the threats against investigators all point to a long-standing conspiracy. The worst thing that happened to the Finch sisters was not getting lost, but being found by people whose culture was based on a terrible secret that they would kill and kill again to keep safe. Where did this illegal botany come from? Dr. Thorne's idea that a European cult moved to the area is interesting. A lot of the first people to settle in the most remote parts of Appalachia were religious dissenters, fringe groups, and people who were running away from persecution. A small isolated group may have brought with them a belief system centered around a sacred plant. During the harsh and hungry early days of settlement, a psychoactive plant that made them feel spiritually connected and maybe even had some healing properties could have become the most important part of their culture. The horrifying practice of human sacrifice may have been invented by Americans as a grim way to cope with the harshness of life on the frontier and the isolation that allowed taboos to fade. The first time they replanted may have been out of desperation, to make sure the sacred plant made it through a harsh winter by feeding it with the only fertilizer they had, a dead person from the community. What started as a desperate act could have turned into a holy doctrine over the years, a ritual that required new soil to please the mountain spirit and keep the clan's wealth growing. People would have seen the Finch sisters as the biggest threat to this weak, bloody tradition because they were smart and curious. Their scientific research was a light shining into a darkness that had been around for hundreds of years. The darkness responded with brutal, ritualistic violence to keep itself from being seen. The disappearance of the Finch sisters still has an effect on the area in small ways. It feels wrong to tell this story because it has been so quiet for so long. The journal, sketchbook, and locket are like ghosts, tiny, real things that are part of a much bigger, hidden horror. They are the pieces that survive the community's determined attempt to erase the sisters from history. The story has become a part of the Smoky Mountains' mental landscape. It shows that there are still places in the world where older, darker things can live on, even though we think our world is civilized and well-known. The national park is a thin layer of modernity over a land that has deep and terrible memories. It has paved roads and visitor centers. The story tells us that the line between folklore and forgotten history is often blurry. It also tells us that the scariest monsters are not supernatural creatures, but the darkness that can grow in a person's heart when they are alone. The long silence about the case says a lot. It tells us about a community that was bound by a terrible oath and a sin that was passed down from parent to child. Not only the Blackwoods knew the secret of the Whispering Cove, everyone who lived in their shadow did too. They all chose to look the other way instead of facing the horrible truth about their neighbors. Let's think about the sketchbook again. In all of history, this is the strongest voice. It is Lyra's story, told through pictures that everyone can understand. In the art world, the change in her work would be seen as a sudden, violent change from romanticism to a dark, scary kind of surrealism. But this wasn't an artistic choice. It was a sign of a mind that was under attack. We can follow the sisters' journey into the heart of darkness through the drawing's progression. The peaceful scenes of nature turn into scary ones, with trees that look like they have faces and rocks that look like sleeping animals. Then come the symbols, which are the first signs of intelligence that is both human and alien. Then the dark figures appeared, and her artistic mind tried to give shape to the threat she felt but couldn't see. The Blackwood portraits are expertly creepy, with eyes that seem empty of life. The final drawings are a chaotic explosion of fear, with the mind breaking apart under the weight of an incomprehensible fear. The last self-portrait is a work of art that is very creepy. It is a record of her own murder, drawn by her own hand. It is possibly the most unusual and scary piece of evidence in the history of American crime. It is Lyra's last, desperate message to the world. It took 74 years to find, and even longer to understand. It is still unclear, and maybe impossible to answer, if any part of this dark tradition still exists today. Dr. Thorne's research into the Nantahala hikers and the possibility of moving the clan is based on guesswork, but it is very disturbing. It seems impossible for such a community to stay hidden in today's connected world. Still, there are huge areas of wilderness in the Appalachian Mountains where someone could go missing without a trace. A small, close-knit group could stay alone there with discipline and determination. The story of the Finch sisters is a scary reminder that the past is never really gone. Sometimes it isn't even over. It is dormant in the soil, in the bloodlines, and in the stories that only family members tell. The oldest families in the area still don't say anything. People in some areas will give you cold stares and shut doors if you ask about the Blackwoods or the Whispering Cove. The memory is still there, and so is the urge to keep it safe. The descendants of the witnesses, if not the offenders, may still be aware of what their ancestors did and what they concealed. The guilt, or maybe the pride, of that heritage may still be a strong force that brings people together. The garden may not be hungry anymore, but the roots of secrecy are still strong. What if the Blackwoods' belief wasn't completely false? The scientific examination of the ghost orchid reveals a profoundly unsettling prospect. The plant's structure contained human DNA, which suggests a biological process that is similar to the clan's terrifying mythology. The plant really was eating its victims. This takes the story out of the realm of ritualistic murder and into something that is almost like science fiction or cosmic horror. What if the Animaradix wasn't just a plant, but a semi-sentient parasite that lived with the Blackwood family and helped them? Maybe the plant didn't control the family. The plant controlled them. People have been eating its psychoactive compounds for generations, which may have changed their brain chemistry and made them obey the organism's biological need to eat and reproduce. The rituals, the sacrifices, and the secrecy could all have been things that the plant did to stay alive, with the humans as its willing but misguided caretakers. It's scary to think that the Blackwoods might not have been evil in a way we can understand. They might have been possessed by a living thing that made them act like puppets, something horrible and hungry that they thought was a god. So, the Finch sisters were not only killed by a cult, but they were also fed to an alien intelligence that had settled in the Appalachian Mountains' ancient soil. The full written confession of Elizabeth McCoon has never been made public. The WPA files are still secret and can only be seen by a few special researchers. The page that Arabelle Crane said was missing from the file is thought to have had the most damaging information of all, the names of the other families who were at the ritual. This makes it seem like the cover-up wasn't just to protect the Blackwoods, but also to protect the founding families of the whole area. It's very likely that the descendants of these families are still important people in their communities today. If the truth came out, it would destroy the whole history of the area, showing that ritual murder was at the heart of their society. This is why the silence has lasted so long and been so complete. There is a conspiracy that goes beyond one family. It is a deal made in blood and soil generations ago. The missing page means that we will never know who was responsible for Ara and Lyra Finch's deaths. It will always be kept secret in a government archive, a final, successful act of silencing the victims and protecting the guilty. Let's go back to the sketchbook to finish. The 1958 investigation put it in an evidence locker in the Sevier County Courthouse, where it stayed mostly forgotten for decades. A historical society that was putting together an exhibit on the area's unsolved mysteries formally asked to show the item in 2015. The clerk went to get the sketchbook from the archives, but it wasn't there. There is no record of it being taken out, moved, or destroyed. It just disappeared, like the sisters did, and like the truth about what happened to them. The silence has taken away the strongest piece of evidence in this creepy cold case. Who would want it? Someone who collects strange and creepy things? Or maybe a descendant of one of the families that saw it, trying to get rid of the last piece of visual evidence that could hurt them? Or maybe, just maybe, someone wants to give it back to its rightful owner. It's scary to think that there is still a garden growing in the deepest, darkest part of the mountains, cared for by people with dark eyes who don't speak. A garden that will always be a part of the people who learned its secrets. A garden that is always looking for new dirt. When you walk a quiet trail through a deep forest and feel that primal, unexplainable feeling of being watched, stop and listen. You might only hear the wind in the trees, but in the old hollows of the Great Smoky Mountains, some say the wind still carries whispers of a forbidden botany, a ghostly white flower, and two sisters who went looking for a rare plant and found instead a terrifying ancient truth. They were told that their spirits would find peace in the root after they died, but the frantic, scared energy in Lyra's last drawing makes it seem like something else. Their souls never found peace. They are still stuck there, in the pages of a lost sketchbook and in the DNA of a huge flower. Their story is a last creepy warning. Some places shouldn't be explored, some secrets shouldn't be known, and some gardens are cared for with terrifying devotion, always waiting for new seeds to plant.